All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started tonight. I want to welcome you all to our living room lecture series for those who haven't joined us before. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we have Stan Berryman with us tonight for Looking Down the Rabbit Hole, Santee Greens Revisited. My name is Stephanie Sandoval. I'm the Deputy Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. Just a reminder to visit our website, san diego archaeology.org, to find out more about the center, our curation efforts, educational programs, and how you can visit the museum. Our next living room lecture is on February 17th. Don Leylander will share his perspective on prehistory of Baja California. And you can register online through our website if you would like to attend. You can find that on your Zoom control panel. We encourage you to enter questions at any time throughout the presentation, and then those will be answered by Stan at the very end through a moderated Q&A. So please make sure you put those questions in when they come up. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Stan Berryman tonight. He received his BA in anthropology at San Diego State University and then went on for his PhD at the University of Leicester. His career in archaeology has been primarily in cultural resource management in both private and government sectors, including managing resources and archaeological studies at the Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, Cleveland National Forest, and at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. Dr. Berryman has since retired from CRM and has most recently been working at New Mexico State University as affiliated faculty assisting at multiple field schools, and currently he is working on a park service. Without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Stan.
All right, we're breaking up a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and just get started. Good evening. I want to thank you all for taking time out from your evening to listen to this paper on the archaeological site known as Santee Greens. Looking at the title slide, you'll see it indicates a slight change in the name of the paper. Thanks to the work by Richard Carrico, I now have the name given to the site by the original Kumeyaay inhabitants, Michagua. I believe that's the pronunciation. And thank you to the San Diego Archaeological Center for sponsoring this series of papers. Also for granting me time to present this paper covering an old site, by which I mean a site that was excavated in a time before there was a name for what most of us now do. In 1980, there was no such thing as cultural resource management. Most likely, if we even thought about what to call the excavation of Santee Greens, we would have said it was salvage archaeology ahead of the bulldozers. However, I also do owe a thank you to A Time for Living, the developer of the property, for sponsoring the work effort, from the beginning through to the end. This paper is really a thumbnail sketch of the results of the excavation and what we are now trying to do with the existing data housed at the SDAC. I think it may be referred to as legacy archaeology, reevaluating existing archive site material, artifacts, notes, photos, ecofacts, etc., recovered from the dark ages of archaeology. What we are trying to do with this legacy site is to live up to the promise to preserve and protect the history of Santee Greens. So now I want to briefly outline the organization of what you're going to hear tonight. First, a history of the excavation. Second, the results of new C14 dating. And my wife Judy and I have sponsored 7 AMS dates. SDAC sponsored 15 dates through a small grant, and the original project 6 dates. However, those 6 dates are very iffy. The C14 in those days was not very precise. And so when you have a plus or minus of over 100, you do have a definite issue with the dates. Finally, then you're going to hear what was recovered in thumbnail sketch form. And then fourth, more than you ever wanted to hear, about projectile points. A little bit about climate relating to the C14 dates and Santee Greens. And the end, all in 1 hour, more or less, when I started putting this paper together, I was without much effort, hitting over 2 hours of talking, describing a project that involved digging over 470 square meters and nearly 1/4 million artifacts. So now I am done with this prepared text mostly. And Santee Greens, Michagua is a late Holocene site located on the northern edge of the San Diego River in the city of Santee. When this project was first conceived, carried out, and completed, we were working under the requirements of the County of San Diego. Now, Santee Greens is located in the city of, like I said, in the city of San Diego. Oops, that's really sensitive. The city of Santee along the San Diego River. It's broken down into 3 loci. Locus A, which is where the Santee Greens project was at, mostly east of Magnolia Avenue. Locus B, which is in a floodplain of the river, in an old quarry and sand mining plant and brick factory, basically. Locus C was left intact up until about 2017 when it was salvage excavated for CRM by Rincon and it was under the direction of Brianna Taylor Campbell. We broke up this site into quadrants. Since we were already working in loci, we had to figure out how to lay out the site and make it understandable. The field director, Keith Poland, and I came up with this approach called quadrants. So we have 2 basic quadrants. Over here, quadrant A, and on the east side, quadrant B. Over here would be locus C. And in between the quadrants is a transition zone. And with this aerial photograph, you can see a number of different test units that we put in this transition zone, as well as a backhoe trench here and a backhoe trench all the way from quadrant A all the way through and into quadrant B. Now, before I go any further, normally this sort of a slide would end at the end of the paper, but I think there may be a few alumni of the Santee Greens project, and if so, hopefully we have all the names of everyone who worked out there. It has been over 40 years, so this is a best shot at it. And but without these folks and without the quality of the work they did, there would be no report to talk about today. And the supervisor for the field work and set up the overall approach in the field was Keith Poland. Supervisor for the laboratory work was Judy Berryman, and then all of these other folks did the grunt work, basically the field work and the analysis, and did really excellent work, especially considering that this was within a time that I'd started in 1973 doing culture resource management work. This was 1978. And also, when you look at this list of folks, I seriously doubt you'll find anyone who has a more than a BA. This was at a time when no one in academia wanted to touch doing what we now call CRM. I think 2 of the most important names are down in the lower right-hand corner down here. And the Native American advisors, Tony Pinto and Rosalie Robertson. As project manager, I spent a great deal of time working with Tony and Rosalie on repatriating and reburial of the human remains that came out during this excavation. Something I'm really very proud of, because this was well before the days of the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It was something that everyone thought was necessary to do and absolutely the right thing to do. Now, this little collage of photographs lays out the kind of equipment we were using. Now, when we did the field work, the first thing we did, well, obviously, was find the site. Then we did a surface survey and laid out over 300 auger units. And we used a tractor mounted power auger to auger those 300 and some units. We screened everything, logged everything into a logbook like this. And this kind of logbook was also used for the trenches and for the excavation units. Everything was shot in using an optical theodolite. There were no laser theodolites that I'm aware of, or if they were brand new and just coming into fashion. We mapped a lot of it with plane table and alidade, which is something I dearly love. When you do an alidade map, you don't walk out of the field with a bunch of numbers. You walk out of the field with an actual map. We backhoe trenched the length of the site and twice with 2 different backhoe trenches, laid it out based on the auger units. Then losing my arrow, there we go. We were using the high end of the computing at those days. This little computer down in the left-hand corner is a TRS-80, also known as a Trash 80. It was a Tandy. You would buy them at Radio Shack. And this had the incredible capacity of 25K memory. One of the dual disk drives we would put in the program. The other dual disk drive you would put in a 5.25 or 5.5 inch floppy disk with the data. You'd lay out the parameters of what you wanted to be done based on the program, which in this case was social statistical stat pack. And I recall one case where we were doing comparison of all of the different milling stones, laid in the parameters that we wanted done. At 4 o'clock when we got ready to go home, we punched run. Came back the next morning and it was still sitting there going chukung, 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 back and forth. And we finally got a printout about 2 or 3 hours later. So it wasn't a real high-speed process. We ended up doing much of the analysis by hand. Everything was typed and put together on a IBM Selectric. All of the graphics were hand done with repetigraphs and rub-on letters. Nothing was so nicely done as a cut and paste with a computer. In fact, the term cut and paste was exactly that. You'd cut out what you wanted, paste in something new. So this is how archaeology was done back in the Dark Ages, and what we're trying to continue to do our studies with. But I think the work was extremely good, especially for the time. And even in today's world, I've looked after looking at the 900-page report that Judy prepared for this project. It was really well done. Okay, now locus A, quadrant A was defined using natural topographic features, soil depths, types of soil encountered, and placement of excavation units. It was divided into 8 clusters. These excavation units would have been considered one cluster. This down here would have been probably another cluster, and here. So it was all laid out. The clusters were not anything other than just the distribution of the excavation units. Cluster size and unit designation based on aerial distributions. 66 excavation units in this quadrant were done. They were 1.5 by 1.5 meter squares or 2.5 by 2.5 meter squares. The general size, which you see these smaller ones, are 1.5 by 1.5. And the reason we picked that size, is that we were just coming from the days of when everything was in a standard English unit. And so the standard excavation size in the 70s and 80s and before was 5 feet by 5 feet. And 1.5 by 1.5 translates very nicely between that size. It's what we were used to working in. And the 2.5s were really excellent for opening up and looking at some of the features. And there were 11 separate archaeological features. Most of the where the defined features occurred between 50 and 70 centimeters deep. And the reason for that is that we had geomorphology done on this overall site of 29,000 square meters. And we found that because of the agriculture that had been going on out here for 50 years, the upper 40 centimeters was very disturbed. And so almost everything that will be discussing starts at 40 centimeters. Locus A, quadrant B was defined in the same way as quadrant A. There were 13 clusters, 2 major block exposures, 140 1.5s and 2.5s, 11 separate archaeological features, and most of the defined features within locus B occurred between 40 and 70 centimeters. And then we have the locus C, which designates that part of SDI 5669 excavated by Rincon Consultants in 2017. They did a surface survey. The phase 2 was shovel test pits and a test unit. Phase 3 was data recovery of 45 1/2 meter units and 40 1/1 meter units. Now, one of the things I wanted to point out is this area here, and this is just an aside, because I was raised in El Cajon in a small community called Bostonia, and spent a great deal of time out in this general area in Santee, hiking, and also used to go hunting in the many dairies that were located in Santee. But one of the things is these are radio transmitter towers, and they were out here, or a form of these towers were out here when I was in high school. And my association with Santee Greens started back then when we would, my buddies and I would get into a car and come out here to what was, there was a house in this area, and the DJs would often come out and do their shows in the evenings from out here in Santee, and we'd come out and hang out. And in many ways, it was a lot like American Graffiti with Wolfman Jack. Anyway, just an aside, has nothing to do with the archaeology, but I did have an early connection with Santee Greens. Here, I'm just going to show you the artifacts by quantity, and I won't guarantee this is 100% accurate. One of the things I'd like to be able to do is to get a good recatalog of everything. But you can see the ceramics. This is locus A, quadrant A, locus A, quadrant B, and locus C. And well, very close to 250,000 different objects came out from this site. Primary flakes, secondary flakes, ceramics, groundstone, core hammerstones, and flake lithics. It was then an amazing amount of material that came out, and it still is. Now, we did do a lot of faunal work, and what's interesting is on these quadrant A and quadrant B, you'll notice that the 4 top species, those are the 4 most found faunal remains in the site. And number 1 was cottontail rabbits and black-tailed jackrabbits. The lagomorphs are interesting because working at White Sands Missile Range, I've been working in Guernanamo sites. And in the case of one, that I can remember, it was a pit house village, much like Santee Greens, and actually not too distant in the time frame of probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 or 900 AD. Cottontail rabbits constituted 97% of the protein and animal bones found in that particular pit house. I'm not sure of the quantity relationships here, but I suspect that cottontail and black-tailed jackrabbits, the lagomorphs, will be the vast majority of the remains found and eaten by the people at this site. I have a wide variety of species of shell and shellfish for being 18 or 19 miles inland from the ocean. Now, again, the golden colored ones are the most prevalent. All of these, if you take this entire two sets of tables, these are the shell that came out of quadrant B. The shell that came from quadrant A are shown with stars along the right-hand edge of the tables. Again, it's a pretty amazing amount of material, especially when you consider that if you get up into northern San Diego County at Camp Pendleton area, you rarely find anything, even on the sites on the coast, anything that approximates this in the number of shellfish and the variety of shellfish. Up there, you're going to be lucky to find bean clam. It's just an amazing amount to me, and it's something that really needs to be worked on. And you're going to hear me say that a number of times, because one of the things I'd like to do is promote more work on this and other sites that have already been previously excavated. Now, we had the entire site professionally flown, and geodetically mapped, and they mapped all of the locations of the units and laid out the quadrants. Like, this is quadrant A, quadrant B, and the transition zone. You can see the trenches coming across, trench coming through. Here we have a trench all the way through quadrant A, and then another trench, I believe, right about here. Again, it was, and then you can see that we didn't, even though the majority of the work, the majority of the effort was in these areas here and right here in this quadrant, large number of outlying test units were excavated throughout these two quadrants, and then a number of test units were excavated in the transition zone. Now, quadrant A, if you look and you can see the yellow, I hope you can on your computers. These are where we took new radiocarbon samples from. Cindy Stankowski was really very helpful and very nice to pull the samples from the different units that we wanted to run tests on. What we tried to do with as much as possible was to get, whenever possible, 2 radiocarbon dates separated, or sometimes 3, so we could see how everything lays out in superposition and get an idea of oldest and youngest use in these different features. Now, quadrant A features, we dated feature 5, feature 24, and feature 51, which we'll have just a little bit of talk about here in just a minute. You can see that the original definition of these different features, we had hearth areas and cooking areas and hearth scatters, because some of these would be totally blown out and scattered as opposed to tightly clustered hearths like they would have originally been. Lithic workshop and hearth area. A couple of them were so sparse we really weren't sure exactly what they were. We found a lithic reduction area, dispersed hearth area, and I don't know how many times you can talk about different definitions for hearth. So we had dispersed hearth area, localized hearth area. We had lithic reduction feature 51, which is a huge area. We have a hearth area along with a lithic reduction area, possible male and female work areas. Now, feature 5 consisted of 34 thermally fractured rocks in 2 units of the feature. Scattered ash deposits and burned animal bone were found. A total of 1,710 artifacts were collected from the 2 units that make up feature 5. And this included 808 T-zone brownware ceramic sherds that were found down to 80 to 90 centimeters, 886 chipstone 11 milling stones, 5 flake lithics, and 16 whole or fragmented projectile points. Feature 24, we had 1,209 artifacts collected from the 2 units that make up the feature. 672 T-stone brownware ceramic sherds, 497 chipped stone flakes, 38 milling tools, and 7 flake lithic tools. Feature 24 probably represented a localized hearth area, along with a probably just cooking and general household use. Now, at the very end of this, I'm going to show you a drawing of how I think these would have laid out. Now, feature 51. This is a drawing of one of the drawings of feature 51 that was done by our graphic artist. But to me, the important, this thing is this was done in the field by archaeologists who hand drew all of these, measured them all in, and I think they did an amazing job on this. And it's a very large, those are 2.5 by 2.5 square units. So it gives you an idea of the size of this feature. And it was made up of intensive ash and charcoal deposits found between 50 and 110 centimeters. Approximately 65 pounds of ash were removed from this unit. Charred animal bones, charred seeds, and small pieces of burnt vegetable matter. There was a real lack of thermally fractured rock and hearthstones found in direct association with the ash deposit. And it was considered an ash dumping area, which is something I've seen at pit houses in the Mogollon area, where would possibly be an old excavated hearth, and then clean out, as they would clean out a hearth underused, they would dump it into this old hole and eventually fill it all in. The dates, I'm going to give you the median probability of these dates as opposed to the normal 2-date probability. So the dates on this were 1511 median probability, 1514, and 1503. Now, we did do one of the units, or one of the dates that we took, the last one, the 60 to 70 centimeter at 1505 AD. We also did a UC California Riverside date back in 1981 on that 60 to 70 level from that same unit, and we had a date of 1252, which points to one of the problems with those earlier dates is the lack of precision. So we do get oftentimes dates that don't coincide with the new modern AMS dating. The UCR dates got us into, as I like to say, we got it into the church, but we didn't get us into the right pew as we were trying to analyze this. I'd like to do some more dates in this area to see what the pattern of usage is. This was only taken from just 1 or 2 units in this overall feature. These are the dates that we ran within quadrant A, and even though we also still had some earlier dates, but most of them confirm in the 1500s, 1400s. Quadrant B features hearth, extramural, which would be a hearth or something outside of a house, hearth, ritual, hearth, thermal features, ritual inhumation. This is the cremation that was recovered and reinterred out at Queapipe at one of the cemeteries. We had a hearth with pot drop, which is not a really good term, more like a pot break. Food preparation areas, workshops, food preparation shop with an earth oven and hearths. We took dates from for the modern dates from 4 of the features. This is where quadrant B, the features that we took the dates from are in this cluster in the northern edge of the quadrant B, again, where the yellow is. This is one huge block. It's about 16 meters across. And we took a couple of dates from this. We have a trench, and this trench had a date which was run and sort of help focus on doing work in this area. So even though the date was a bit early, it still got us into the right pew, at least getting her into the right church, knowing this was an area we really wanted to excavate in. And then just recently I had 2 dates run down here in the southern portion of Quad B to get a feel for how the dates relate to up here. And we find that there is a strong pattern of about 400 or 500 years of use of this area throughout here. The dates looking at the mean probabilities along the right-hand column. You can see that they run from the 1100s, the 1000s, all the way up to the 1800s, with a clustering between 1400 and 1500, 1600. This is feature 53. I find this one fascinating. I mean, look at that. To me, the amount of rock out here just shows that this was heavily used. We have feature 51, scatters emerged at the 40 to 50 centimeter level and ended at the 60 to 70, with some evidence of activity going down to the 90 centimeter level. 4 possible hearth or earth oven areas were noted within the feature. And that would be here, 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 and here. And there is what looks like possibly was recorded as possibly an actual living surface. One of the things I want to do when COVID is a little more under control and can feel like I can travel, I want to get over to the Arc Center, pull out the log books for this particular feature and look at this and see if it continued over here, since this is only a representation of a part of this overall feature. 4 possible hearth or earth ovens were noted. We had 50 awls discovered in the feature, along with a cache of incised steatite. The dates, median probability of the dates were 1410 and 1349. So we had good superposition on these dates, and it's consistent with at least 60 years of use within portions of this overall feature. Now, we talked about agriculture uses of the site. This hash marked line and this hash marked line are actually plow marks, plow scars in the feature itself, probably at about 50 centimeters. But what's interesting is you have disturbance here and here, but this is the intact pot break right here. So even though with the plowing, once we got down below towards the bottom of the plow zone itself, things that they were not disturbing and moving around necessarily all of the feature. And feature 50 began as 4 units excavated to determine the aerial extent of an ash and charcoal lens. Feature 50 is one of a number of individual features within the overall what was defined by Keith as feature 50. So you had feature 50, 50A, B, C, D, E, and F. And feature E was a large concentration of potsherds. And it was noted that several large rim sherds were present in the concentration, and they exhibited incising. This decoration included a single line incised band, a singular crosshatch band, and a double droplet shape pattern. And the overall date would be a median probability of the date would be AD 1768. And this is the drawing of the pot, and you can see the incising along the top and this teardrop along the edge, and there would be a teardrop on the other side. This is a photograph of an Oya that was made by Rosalie Robertson and gifted to my wife and myself. But I put it in as an example of this particular shape and style. Now the dates, looking at the range of dates, there are 3 distinct clusters, AD 900 to 1300, roughly in here. AD 1350 to 1600. Come on, right in here. And 1640 to 1900. So we have 3 tight clusters of dates, which I think show and point out that even with this outlier out here, that it's very possible that Santee Greens was first occupied in the 800 AD and 900 AD timeframe as probably a refuge from the droughts that were going on during that time period, and setting up some living areas along the banks of the San Diego River. And I'll go into this towards the end of the paper, as the droughts ended and we moved into wetter cycles, we began to see larger and more clustered use of the site at least based on the radiocarbon dating. Now, however, taking that as not necessarily as gospel that they were large aggregations coming in at the time, the date spread itself may be an artifact of the selection of the carbon samples used for dating, or an issue with old wood. But I think what we've got is such a pattern here, and it matches a pattern up along the northern coast on Camp Pendleton, that I think we're beginning to see that as the climate changed in the AD 1300s, more and more people moved in, and we see a stronger use pattern of the sites. Now, projectile points. I'll spend a bit of time on this. I don't want to run out of time here on the talk, but at the simplest, projectile points to be discussed can be distilled down into some very basic morphological types. Triangular no notch, triangular basal notch, side notch, side notch with basal notch, corner notch, stemmed with corner notch, and no stem corner notch. And there are names assigned to all of these that are based on the geographic area where the projectile points were originally discovered. I have a bit of a problem with that when I do the projectile point analysis, because these points are found all over the West, especially the Southwest. And it really makes understanding them and their distribution difficult when you have different names given to the same points, same style of points. I'd rather go along with a morphological description of the points. Now, the material used to make the points at Santee Greens are generally locally available metavolcanics, quartz, quartzite, siliceous chert, chalcedony, and obsidian. XRF studies on obsidian by Stephen Shackley show they were made from obsidian butte obsidian. I changed this chapter, but it did not take. So anyway, chert was also looked at, and among the sources were points made from Piedras Lumbres chert, only available from one source on Camp Pendleton, over 68 miles from Santee Greens. Now, we've got triangular no-notch points. And triangular no-notch variants have a variety of names that relate generally to a limited region, such as Bull Creek, Sovapuri, Kohonina. However, Cottonwood triangular is the name given to this style by Lanning in 1963, and you'll often find Cottonwood in use in many various areas alongside with some of the other names, such as Sovapuri or Kohonina. Of the 616 complete partial and identifiable fragments of projectile points from locus A. 360 were identified as triangular no-notch cottonwood. Of the 360 points, 107 were unbroken, accounting for 30% of the identifiable cottonwood points. These broken points show primarily a bend break pattern, which breaks are perpendicular to the point length. And you can see those like here, and we've got a couple of them in through here. Most breaks are towards the tip. A few breaks are crushing or bend hinge breaks, always appearing on the distal end. Break damage includes use damage such as striking a hard bone object, antler, wood, or accidental damage or trampling. It might be a break resulting from manufacture caused by reshaping or resharpening or remodeling of the point. I've calling these projectile points uncommon. Out of the hundreds that we have, there are only 21 examples of serrated projectile points, at least that I have noted it to date. Of these, 2 have serrated edges with side notches, 10 have triangular, straight and slightly convex bases, and 9 are triangular with deeply concave bases, such as these. We have, this is the sum and total of the number of drills we found in all of the excavation. And same with the tri-notch. And the tri-notch is your basic side notch with a itty bitty little notch in the base. Other uncommon points are, and I just really like these. These are just, I don't know what there is about this shape, but I think because we only have 5 or 6, there's more to this than just a broken projectile point. I refer to them as a bifurcated point, and they're not projectile points per se, but the bases of projectile points that underwent shearing fracture that resulted in a Burin break pattern, and a Burin would be like this tip. Where's my point on this one? And these are all have been also subsequently broken after the original break of the shearing break. The corner notch examples of this style are triangular corner notch projectile points with triangular base, and one exhibiting serrated edges. The tips are either broken or acute, and that is the acute tip right there. We have a few faint notch, side notch points. If you look, you can barely see a very, very faint notch on these, and I went ahead and broke them out of the normal side notch and put them in their own little category. And there's about 6 of those, I believe. Desert side notch are found throughout the Southwest. The side notch projectile point variants include, but are not limited to, desert side notch, Chaco, Pueblo, Schwartz. Use extends from 1100 AD to about 1400 among the Pueblo. It extends to the historic, represented in proto-historic in Southern California among the Apache in the Southwest. This little point down here is a Sierra point. I put it in because it's the only one that looks like that. We have this, it's up here, but it's the only point that we have like this. It's a style that it comes from the Eastern Sierra. It's a late Holocene style point, and it Steve Shackley thought it might have been broken and resharpened in half, but it's an actual style that you can find in the Sierra, and this is made out of obsidian, butte obsidian, so it's local manufacture. So somewhere along the line, someone developed the idea for this shape, and then put it into form, and we found it out at Santee Greens. Yeah. Side notch points came into use at Santee Greens through trade of materials and ideas with the people of the American Southwest, including the Hohokam and the Members and Jornada Mogollon. Based on the dates originally conducted for 5669 and on radiocarbon dates recently run, desert side notch points were in use at the site by at least AD 1349, right up to the historic period. Looking at that spread of time, nearly 500 years, only 62 side notch points were found during excavation of the 471 square meters at Santee Greens. This point style was not used extensively by the residents of Santee Greens, but it's found extensively throughout the site. 34 side notch points exhibit bend break damage resulting from striking hard objects. Unlike cottonwood points, the desert side notch points are relatively thin in cross section and may be more subject to accidental damage than the thicker cottonwood points. So were these rarer points used in hunting or other activities, or were they used more in ritual, along with the even rarer multi-side notch points, which will come up here in just a few minutes? It is possible that the idea of side notch and multi-notch points were traded in as ritual items. They slowly diffused across into our area. So McDonald in 1992 posited that the small notch points from her project site at Indian Hill date from 890 plus or minus 50 BP radiocarbon years and calibrated at 1034 to 1275 AD with a median date of 1150. Now, entry into San Diego has been looked at by Pignolo in 2004, and that's a good report that I would really suggest anybody who wants to learn more about desert side notch and trade of items in Southern California would want to take a look at. As I said earlier, it was influenced from the east by the Hohokam and the Mogollon. The Pueblo and Chaco side notch variety ended around 1400, a little bit after they started entry into Southern California. Side notch as a form may have had uses other than hunting activities. So you can see that it came in from this direction into San Diego. And how do we know? Well, this is the work that Andrew did on desert side notch. This is out of his report. And if we take the arrow that I just showed you coming up this way, the numbers here are percentage of side notch points in a collection at a given site. So here in Jacumba, at least one site had 100%, we had 67%, 6,300%, slowly moving north, east. Well, this 8% is Santee Greens. And you can see that as we move northeast, the desert side notch points become less and less frequent, less and less a part of the overall collection. Now, the other side notch point that I wanted to discuss a little bit is the what I refer to as multi-side notch, or the Dos Cabezas style. The multi-side notch form extends from the Southern California coast to the greater Southwest and all the way into the Great Plains. Dos Cabezas points date from 1034 to 1257 with a median date of 1155. Radiocarbon dates conducted at Santee Greens place the date of use of the multi-side notch point at 1152. Excuse me, although they were found into the later dated periods as late as 1511, it is a distinct possibility that these points, because of their odd shape, were curated and ritually used. Now, what I wanted to show you is that this is the Kelly site, which is a Membris period site in central New Mexico, and these date around 1200 AD, and these would be called Temporal there. We go to San Diego County, and these what are the same in my estimation points, the Dos Cabezas points found at Santee Greens, and they date around 1155, 1155 to about 1511, and they're basically the same point. Dos Cabezas and Temporal are really the same point, just found 900 miles apart. In fact, this point right here is an analog almost for this point right here. The only major difference between these projectile point styles is the curved base. I think that because ritually projectile points often represented lightning, I have a feeling that these may well be a lightning style projectile point. And this is what I was just going over, and you know, looking at the spread of time of nearly 500 years at Santee Greens, and only 62 desert side notch points, and those 9 Dos Cabezas points found during the excavation of 471 cubic meters. This style was not used extensively. I think it was being used, had a different purpose than just necessarily hunting. So just a couple quick discussion about projectile point uses, you know, and that is that the versatile projectile point is generally thought as a killing tool. It, however, has other purposes for religious and for protective purposes. When I originally started laying this out, this particular discussion had like 6 pages of examples of other uses for projectile points. Now in the Southwest, projectile points were used in ritual, including protection ceremonies, subsistence ceremonies, and rites of passage ceremonies. Points were found placed in roof materials and pueblo walls, protecting the inhabitants of the rooms. They were found in or on floors, evidence of ritual closing of a room during abandonment. Among the Acmil Oodam, or the Pima Alto and Gila Pima, the bow and arrow were used for both hunting and for war, according to Ezel. The Pima Alto used solid, untipped arrows for hunting and arrows tipped with projectile points only for war. Among the Kumeyaay, the Ipai Tipai, projectile points were used for hunting and for protection. Stone arrowheads were used against big game only. According to Spear, arrowheads are placed under rocks about the camp to prevent its inmates from being bewitched. Also, you know, they primarily used the stone points again against big game. Now I'm just going to go through a few of the drawings of some of the artifacts we found. We're pretty well wrapped up on the projectile points and on the home stretch here. But I just wanted to show an example of some of the different kinds of artifacts that we have. And these are all drawings that came from the original report. Drilled bone pendant. We had a pendant fragment, work bone with cross hatching on it. We have work bone again with symbols on cross hatched on it. A bone awl. One of the elders that I had occasion to work with back in the 80s and 90s, I asked him what a bone awl was used for, and he explained that bone awls were used for making and tying thatching onto houses. So it was, and also in basketry. Incise shaft straightener. One of the things I like about drawings over photographs is that a lot of times you get a lot better representation of the kinds of alterations made to an artifact. A drilled steatite firebowl, I believe. With crystal, red abalone pendant, shell and steatite beads. This was a cluster that was reburied ultimately, I believe, with the cremation that it was found with. It was reburied on Clea pipe. Now I'm going to go through one last thing, which I hope will tie some of this together, but it's also part of the research that I'm wanting to do. And that is the C14 dates and climate. Looked at 3 different reports that used tree rings as analogs for dates and for climate. And Stein worked up in eastern Sierra, Mono Lake, Larson, and I'm not sure if he has published this article, but he did most of his tree ring studies along the central California coast, Crescino Mayor in the southwest along Fort Bliss White Sands Missile Range up into the Sacramento and San Andres Mountains. And we have the dates running down here. For Stein, they go from AD 892 down to 1350. For Larson, AD 500, 600 to AD 1300. For Crescino Mayor, 940 down to 1305. But the important thing is what's going on during these different time periods climatically. And we have throughout the Holocene, extreme changes in the weather between low rainfall, drought, extreme drought, wet, severe drought, short wet, interval and drought, moderately dry, very wet, drought, extremely harsh, very wet, improving, drought. And then after 1350, we go into the more modern weather. And for the last 500 or so years, 600 years, we've had very moderate weather with periods of drought and periods of wet, but very much more moderate and cooler than these earlier periods within the early Holocene. Now, Stein, using tree rings from relic tree stumps found in 4 sites close to and within the central Sierra Nevada mountains, that the medieval period in California was thus marked not only by severe and prolonged drought, but by abrupt and extreme hydroclimatic shifts from inordinate dryness to inordinate wetness and back again, which sounds terribly familiar. The first medieval drought lasted for over 220 years, from AD 892 to 1115. During this time period, we do see a few dates of use of Santee Greens. And in a drought, where would you want to go? Well, I would head to the river myself and a source of water. The second drought lasted for 140 years, AD 1209 to 1350. After AD 1350, wet, dry cycles became less severe. The climate generally becomes more benign, interspersed with several short-term droughts and wet periods, and finally ends with the modern Anthropocene. But this 15 period, if you remember back to the slide with the radiocarbon dates, this is when we begin seeing more and more dates coming out for Santee Greens. We also, again, and I'm using the experience I had at Camp Pendleton, because that's where I wrote my thesis on. This is the time period when you start seeing aggregation of populations along the big villages and new villages going inland from the coast. Now, there are 2 other phenomena that affected climate and perhaps helped the late Holocene to remain a period of cool, wet environment. The Little Ice Age was a cool, wet period that followed the medieval climatic anomaly from AD 1350 to 1850. Another phenomenon known as the Maunder minimum, prolonged sunspot minimum, occurred from AD 1645 to AD 1715. This period of limited sunspot activity corresponded with the coldest phase of the Little Ice Age. This is the period noted by myself in which data derived from Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton shows human population expansion and aggregation at large permanent residential sites. Now, I got a little bit more here on this, and then we're going to wrap this up. All right, here we go. So what does this mean for 13 years at Camp Pendleton? It also often slips out. What does this mean for Santee Greens? It is possible that the southern coastal California experienced less moisture than did more northerly California. Perhaps it was not as dry as that indicated by Stein and Gracino-Mayer, but certainly dry enough to constitute a drought. For reviewing table 3, or the last table that I showed you, there is a dry period within the span of AD 1300 to approximately 1350, followed by fluctuating periods of wet and dry conditions. Based on this and generally lower amounts of rainfall historically in San Diego County, it is feasible that there were periods of dry and wet weather AD 1208 to 1600. These periods were suitable for population growth and aggregation into communities like Santee Greens, seen in the range of sites and the dates at Santee Greens. The drought periods identified by Stein would result in stress on the human population throughout the southern half of North America. The Southern California climatic plant landscape was changeable, but accounted for long extended periods of either dry or wet weather. There is more to the human response to climate shifts than just changing resource exploitation and changing settlement patterns. A prolonged drought, as described by Stein, Larson, and Gracino-Mayer, will be viewed differently by individuals depending on when in time they experience the event. If a person is born during a long drought, they will see the dry as the norm. And if the event is experienced at its beginning or end, that experience will result in different perception and thus the response to the climatic event. Equally important to the dry drought periods are the wet phases. In either case, the climate has turned wet or dry. Humans individually and communally will develop different senses of both the physical and ideational landscapes that constitute normal. Regardless, a drought should result in use of physical locations that have access to water, which is why I think that those earlier dates with droughts are probably accurate along at Santee Greens because of their proximity to the water of the San Diego River. The radiocarbon landscape ties it all together by giving time depth to the changes occurring in the late Holocene post 1350, the beginning of the more stable weather patterns. Based on calibrated radiocarbon dating, people were beginning to use locus A of Santee Greens possibly as early as 676 or to 943, with a median probability date of 817. As stated in the above, the first medieval drought lasted for over 220 years, AD 892 to 1115. The second lasted for a period of 140 years, AD 1209 to 1350. Radiocarbon dates from Santee Greens indicate some use of the site during this time period. The dates include AD 994 to 1040, 1323 to 1400, 1306 to 1409, and AD 900 to 1394. These dates point to the use of the site during severe, long-lasting drought. With only the exception of AD 994 to 1040, there was an overlap of the drought period dates. Albeit limited in scope, the settlement was along the north bank of the San Diego River because it was attractive as a source of water, edible plants, and animals. The dates point to a persistent use of Santee Greens, in all probability by foragers. As the drought effects lessen and the climate shifts to wetter and more stable times, the site beginning in AD 1300 with what appears to be continuing growth into 1400 and 1500, and evidence of continuing use into AD 1600s, focused in quadrant A. From AD 1600 through 1700, the dates expanded use within quadrant A, locus A, quadrant B. As stated above, the first medieval drought lasted for over 220 years. As drought effects lessen, the climatic shifts to wetter, radiocarbon dates point to an increasing use of the site. And I'm pretty much going to wrap it up at that point. What I'm trying to point out is that there is a reason why people focused at Santee Greens and more likely other sites along the river. So I've got about 3 more slides here. And this is what I would like to tackle partially next. These are data data sets, including our floppy disks with material, the notebooks. All of this needs to be gone through. Had plans to do this 2 years ago, and then we got hit with COVID, and it's still sitting there at the SDAC waiting for us. Now, one of the things that I really want to stress, and I'm hoping comes out of this little talk, is that we have a wealth of information sitting at the SDAC, at the San Diego Archaeological Center, waiting to be studied, and we need to spend less time excavating, more time excavating old sites, excavating the data contained in those old sites. Now, I remember one of the things that we used to do, well, still do, we would, when we would be talking to a potential client or an government agency, is why are you doing this? That would be the question. And the answer would be, well, we're preserving this for the future. As we get better technology, we can understand what's going on better. Well, it's been 40, 45 years. We have material sitting in curation that's never been looked at. It needs to be looked at, and it needs to be reevaluated. And it'll answer a lot of the questions that we have about the archaeology of Southern California and any other place that has these same kinds of collections. So I'm really encouraging people to look at these legacy projects as a source of data and as a source of future MAs and PhDs. I used legacy data for my PhD. It works. I think it's of extreme value. Now, the last two slides. This is a Kumeyaay house from the early 1900s. It's a style that it's very familiar to me because it's what was described to me by my aunt, my uncle, and my mother, because they had Kumeyaay friends when they were raised in Alpine. But the important thing is this translates to this absolutely drop dead gorgeous picture. And what we've been talking about today at Santee Greens is, I think, translatable into this overall picture here. We have the houses, which look very much like the house in the photograph, even though this is a pit house village from probably about AD 800 in Phoenix. There's a ramada. People are working in this ramada, building up a midden. When probably there's a hearth out in here. I like to these sorts of pictures really bring home and explain better than words do, I think, sometimes how a site could be potentially used. So this could be that one of the features that we were talking about earlier. And it gets moved over to here, and then over here, and then up here, over the course of like 10 or 20 years. And eventually the midden builds up, and we as archaeologists come out and try and figure out what is going on. And in this case, you've got a lovely small village, a ramada that's being used extramurally to the houses. To me, what this kind of a picture does is it puts the people into the context of the site. It's not just a bunch of rocks, a bunch of artifacts. It's actually people in the landscape, using the artifacts. I could see this if we knock down those hills. This could be Santee Greens very easily, and just quadruple the number of houses, because my estimation on the potential population is probably 200 to 300 people. Anyway, that's where we're at. It's a long process. We had hoped to be a lot further on in reevaluating this legacy project, but we kind of got hammered by COVID and other things, and so we're looking forward to moving on. And I would encourage anyone who wants to work on this or other projects to let the Archaeological Center know. Anyway, and that's pretty much what I've got. I'm happy to take any questions or anything else at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berryman. My name is Dante Ferenga, and I'm the Development and Marketing Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. I'll be moderating the Q&A portion of tonight's discussion. And just as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature located on your Zoom control panel. and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. I believe we have a few. I know you went over this, but if you don't mind, could you just go over again what the original radiocarbon dates were and then the updated radiocarbon dates?
Well, the original radiocarbon dates were in the period between about 800 AD and 1000 AD. And the updated, we have a couple that are in that same time range, but most of the radiocarbon dates range from the 1300s, 1350, right up to the 1800s. And focusing around 13 to 1400 and in that range.
We have a question from Steve Frears who says, "Hi Stan, thanks for your detailed presentation. I understand the reliability problems of late carbon-14 AMS dates and the revised calibration curve. Could you explain the reporting utility of multiple 1 sigma ranges that overlap and the associated median probability dates? Is that publishable?"
Yes, it is publishable. But you know, radiocarbon dates are calibrated based on either an intercept or on a probability. And the probability is based on comparing the radiocarbon date with the with tree ring dates to get your calibration factor. And tree ring dates have a gap, and there are problems with some of the dates, but I think we have such a consistent pattern of dates out at Santee Greens that we definitely have a good shot at being able to, you know, have good reasonable dates to publish. Personally, I would like to get another 5 or 6 dates out in some of the outlying areas of the site to nail down exactly that, you know, we see an overall pattern of use and dates, and that it's consistent throughout the site. I hope that's not too much double speak, but anyway, that's I think these dates are definitely publishable.
Right. From a practical standpoint, could the multiple notches be used for enhanced lashing of a projectile point to the arrow?
Yeah, it's possible. You know, and well, you know, the simple answer is yes, it is very possible to enhance the lashing, but the fact that we have so few, and that they are found in limited quantities throughout the Southwest, and like I said, all the way into the Great Plains, I personally think it's a concept of a projectile point that is used in a ritual. And to me, you know, when this didn't just spring up independently throughout the Southwest, the dates for those Cabezas or Temporals projectile points, multi-side notch points at Santee Greens, are later than the dates in the Mogollon territory. They're later than the dates up in the Great Plains. I think it shows a slow progression of an idea, and the idea is these multi-side notch points. These side notch points are all made out of local material. So I think it's an idea that was transmitted and probably as part of a ritual. And I was just throwing out the idea of the lightning aspect, because projectile points are often considered made by lightning. So, you know, yes, they would enhance lashing, but I'm not sure that it's worth that. You know, what's the level of effort for making those, and then for doing the extra lashing? What's going to be gained? I saw one idea was that it would increase the bloodletting, you know, for when it was shot into a game animal. But I'm not sure, again, that is really the case. So what I would like to do is do some protein residue studies and see if these were used for hunting. So anyway, that's pretty much that, I think.
What do you think about the abundant shells? Were they used throughout the time periods?
Oh, yeah, I think they were. In fact, that was the next thing I would like to do is, I didn't mention this, but all those radiocarbon dates were carbon. We had only one that was bulk soil but no shell. I'd like to be able to select some of the shell and get that dated and see if shellfish was being used throughout the time period of the site, but I suspect it is. And it's a tremendous quantity, and the other thing, the point that my wife Judy has made a number of times to me is that we need to be comparing what's coming from Santee Greens from other sites along the San Diego River to get a better picture of that. And I'd like to know how shellfish was used and what quantities and what types of shellfish were used in other sites, other villages along the river.
And another question on the shell, regarding the marine shell, was any dated and did it appear to span the occupation of the site or one specific time frame?
Well, I think I answered that. We haven't dated it yet, but that's something I would like to do very much. And just exactly for that reason that the questionnaire was put that question together.
And we have a comment from Richard Carrico, and I apologize on the pronunciation right now, but Richard says that his linguist compatriot has referred to the site as Michagua, with her scribed meaning as valley house. Just a comment.
Michagua, okay, that's good to know, because I was pronouncing it just based on phonetics, basically.
And we have a question. Could you talk more about the burials you uncovered? Anything surprising?
Well, we really only the surprising thing is we really only came up with one real burial, and it was a burial of a cremation. And the cremation had, as I recall, a metate over it, and it had all of those those beads that we had the drawing of. To me, we didn't, being a cremation, and there wasn't a lot that we could do with studying the remains. But to me, the important aspect of it is that it opened up an opportunity for us to do a reinterment and reburial of those remains out at Queapipe. And I'm going to take just a minute here to talk a little bit about that, because we spent months putting it together with Rosalie and Tony. We traveled out to the Colorado River and talked to members of the Hilmiap clan, which is the clan that Rosalie and Tony belong to. Put together a ramada on a brand new ramada on Queapipe. Took and put up a little kitchen, brought in food. We had about 120 people, I guess, that came to the reburial, tribal folks. Singers from north, south, east, and west. I was told by one of the participants that they were hearing songs that they hadn't heard for 50 or 60 years being sung, and it was almost like a revival. But it took a lot of effort, but it was important to do, and it's sort of a precursor to NAGPRA, in the sense that we were repatriating and reinterring the remains. The difference was that there was a huge ceremonial that went along with it. Anyway, it was, as the project manager, I guess, for the lack of a better term, I felt really proud of what we did. Now, the unfortunate problem as an anthropologist, we were requested no photographs, no tapes. And so there's no real record of the songs that were sang or the people that were there, but it was quite an event. So that, to me, is the important part of those remains, more so than any scientific value of that particular set that came out.
And speaking of those remains, there was a question, is it possible, with the permission of indigenous ancestors, to get a DNA sample from those human remains?
Well, being cremation, no, and there really wasn't DNA going on in 1980. So we wouldn't have been able to get anything other than maybe a C14 date. And that was an absolute no from Rosie and Tony.
Right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. In the meantime, I would just like to share what our executive director, Cindy Stankowski, has said. She said, it has been my largest disappointment that professional archaeologists haven't been conducting research on the important collections that we curate here at the SDAC. So thank you to both Stan and Judy for continuing this important work. I can't wait to see what comes next. And just as a reminder, if any professional archaeologists or students are interested in doing research, this project was funded with some of our SDAC Archaeological Preservation Fund, and there is funding available. So please contact Cindy if you are interested in performing that research.
And if I can follow up on that.
Yes, please.
I think that that's one of the really important aspects of what we're trying to do. And it is, we as archaeologists, and I'm basically I was thinking the other day, I'm a 40-year-old and a 70-year-old body, and I'm thinking here that over the last 50 years, we have done a tremendous amount of excavation, and we need to get back out and then excavate the remain of the sites that are in the archives. Now go back and re-record the data, redo the catalogs if necessary, do special studies. I'm hoping to get a whole range of studies done eventually. I've applied for grants at least 3 different times and haven't gotten any yet, but I'm hoping to be able to get some grants to be able to do different kinds of studies, including starch, residues, protein residue studies, blood residue, and like to be able to do pollen. If I believe there still should be soil left, and we know there's pollen because we had pollen studies done to determine the potential for being able to do really good quality pollen work, and had geomorphology done and go back and relook at all of that. So these things are sitting in collections, and they need to be, we owe it to the ancestors of the people that are living now to do this work. We owe it to our profession to go back and not just let these languish in collections. As nice a collections as they are at the SDAC, it's, we need to do more.
Thank you. And we have one final question. Has your perspective on Santee Greens changed by virtue of your work in New Mexico?
Yeah, it has. And it's nice to be, think, wow, there's connections between Santee Greens and there. I mean, just looking at the artifacts and looking at the projectile points and whatnot, there's time connections. But there's also connections with how the people were living. I really think that at least Southern California was well on its way to, with the work I've done at Camp Pendleton and here, to becoming, something like Santee Greens being more of a pit house village, which would be traditionally called basket maker in the Southwest, that it was potentially a part of an overall connection to the Hohokam. Ron May discovered some evidence of that back in the 1970s out in the Cuyamacas Laguna area. And then I believe Steve Shackley hypothesized that we were part of this area was part of the Hohokam tradition, and I think that has changed, as opposed to when we first did it, we were looking at a small, well, not a small, but a huge site, but as an single entity, not as an overall pattern that is Southwest, the greater Southwest. I think the Southwest should be defined from, the Pueblo, the Mogollon, all the way to the Pacific coast. So that's the main change is an overall broader perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Stan, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight's living room lecture. Just as a reminder, our lecture series continues in February with Ideas About Baja California's Prehistory, A Personal Perspective by Don Laylander. For more information on this and our other upcoming events, please visit our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org. Thank you again and good night.
Thank you.